There's a kind of man the world quietly tolerates. The one who takes what he wants, who reads silence as permission and fear as consent. History is full of them. Villages remember them longer than they remember kings. And then there's the other kind. The kind who steps forward when everyone else steps back. Who doesn't announce himself. Who doesn't make a speech. Who just stands between the wolf and the flock and says simply without theater, "Not this one." This is a story about one night in a war-torn borderland where a warlord thought he owned the room. Where armed men with blood on their boots believed that power meant choosing. Where a line of terrified women stood waiting for the kind of mercy that never comes from men like that. It is also the story of a war chief named Dawit, a man carved from decades of conflict, a man who had seen what cruelty looked like in every language and uniform, who walked into that room and did something the outlaw never expected. He didn't fight. Not first. He chose. What happened next became the kind of story that gets passed from mouth to ear, from grandmother to granddaughter, across 3 countries and 2 generations. Not because it ended cleanly. It didn't. But because in the middle of the worst kind of human darkness, one man drew a line in the dirt with his boot and said, "Here. No further." This is that story. The village of Coram sat at the edge of a valley that had been fought over so many times it had stopped trying to grow things properly. The soil was tired. The trees that still stood leaned away from the road like they were trying to leave. It was the kind of place that appeared on no tourist map, no government development plan, no foreign aid distribution list. The kind of place that existed mostly in the memories of the people who had survived it and the nightmares of the people who hadn't. It was the dry season. The kind of dry where the air itself felt like an insult, hot, gritty, carrying the smell of dust, and something older underneath, something that had been burning for years. The mountain passes to the north had been contested for 6 weeks. 2 factions, 2 flags, 2 sets of men with guns who both believed they were the righteous ones. The civilians in between, farmers, teachers, mothers, children, old men with nothing left to lose, had long since learned that righteousness was the most dangerous word in any language spoken by someone holding a rifle. The women of Coram had learned to keep their daughters inside after 3 in the afternoon, not because of one incident, because of the accumulation of incidents. The kind of thing that doesn't make international news because it happens too slowly, too consistently, too far from camera. You don't need a massacre to destroy a community. You just need enough afternoons where fathers feel useless and daughters feel hunted and nobody with authority bothers to show up. Warchief Dawit Tesfaye had been traveling for 11 days when his convoy stopped 4 kilometers outside Coram. He was not a young man. 53 years of living in a part of the world that aged men fast had left him with a face like weathered stone, deep lines carved by sun, and grief in equal proportion, eyes that had the particular quality of stillness that belongs only to people who have seen chaos up close and survived it long enough to stop being surprised by it. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way of men who were once powerful and now carried that power differently, like a coat they'd owned for decades. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His hands were large and had done things he did not discuss. He commanded a unit of 42 fighters, not a militia, a disciplined force, trained under a regional peacekeeping agreement that existed mostly on paper, but that Dawit had spent years trying to make real through sheer force of consistency. His men called him Warchief, not as a title of conquest, but as a title of tenure. He had been doing this longer than most of them had been alive. He had buried more people he loved than he cared to count. He did not hate the men on the other side of any particular conflict. He had learned a long time ago that hate was a fuel that burned the container. The reason they stopped 4 kilometers outside Coram was a boy. He was maybe 14, running down the road in the direction away from a village, which was the direction toward Dawit's convoy. He was barefoot. He had been running long enough that his feet were bleeding through the dust. One of Dawit's scouts flagged him down. The boy nearly collapsed into the scout's arms, and when they brought him to Dawit, he was shaking so hard it was difficult to understand his words. Dawit got out of the vehicle. He crouched down, a significant gesture for a man of his size and rank, and put himself at eye level with the boy. He did not ask what happened immediately. He asked the boy his name first. "Jonas," the boy said. "Jonas, are you hurt?" The boy shook his head. Then he looked back over his shoulder at the road, at the dust cloud that was just the wind, but that he apparently couldn't stop interpreting as something chasing him. They came this morning, Jonas said. Kareem's men. Dawit knew the name. Everyone in the region knew the name. Kareem Bashir was not a warlord in the classical sense. He didn't control territory for ideological reasons. He didn't fly a flag with particular conviction. He didn't have a manifesto or a list of demands that anyone took seriously. What Kareem had was 30 armed men, a talent for appearing in places right after the official forces moved on, and an appetite for the specific kind of power that comes from frightening people who cannot fight back. He had operated in this valley for 2 years. He had been reported to 4 different authorities. He was still operating. How many? Dawit asked. Maybe 20. Maybe more. They came to the community hall. They brought. Jonas stopped. Swallowed. They brought the women from 3 households. They lined them up. Dawit's expression did not change. This was a skill he had spent years developing. Not the suppression of emotion, but the management of it, the deliberate choice not to let his face broadcast what his chest was doing. Why are you out here? He asked. My father told me to run. He said, find soldiers, find anyone. The boy looked at Dawit's convoy, at the trucks, and the uniforms and the rifles. He said if I could find the Warchief's men, tell them. He said Dawit Tesfaye keeps his word. That last sentence landed differently than the boy probably intended. It was not flattery. It was a statement of something the community had apparently built an entire survival strategy around. The belief that one specific man, if he could be reached, could be trusted. Dawit stood. He looked back at his convoy. His second-in-command, a woman named Selamawit who had been with him for 9 years, and who communicated most of her important thoughts through precise variations of a single expression, was already standing beside the lead truck, waiting. How long ago did you leave? Dawit asked Jonas. Before sunrise. I have been running since before sunrise. It was now mid-morning. Perhaps 5 hours. Whatever was happening in Quorum had been happening for 5 hours without anyone with authority close enough to intervene. He turned to Selamawit. Fast approach. No sirens. No announcement. I want to know what we're walking into before Kareem knows we're walking into it. She was already moving. They drove the 4 kilometers in 12 minutes. Dawit rode in the second vehicle, not the first, a habit born of hard experience. On the outskirts of the village, a man was sitting on the ground with his back against a wall and his hands pressed to his face. He was not injured. He was the particular posture of a man who had been made to watch something and could not stop seeing it. They did not stop for him. They would come back. The community hall was the largest building in Quorum, which was not saying much. Concrete block construction, a tin roof that had been repaired so many times with different materials that it looked like a patchwork quilt made by someone in a hurry. 2 of Kareem's men were standing outside the entrance. They had rifles. They saw Dawit's convoy, and one of them went inside, and one of them stayed outside and tried to look like he wasn't afraid. Selamawit's team secured the perimeter in under 3 minutes. Dawit walked toward the entrance alone. This was deliberate. He wanted to be seen walking alone. He wanted the calculation of the situation to be obvious to everyone inside, that he had chosen to come in without guns drawn, which meant the next move belonged to whoever was running things in there, and whatever they chose would determine what the men outside did next. The guard at the entrance was maybe 22. His rifle was held across his body in a way that was technically threatening and practically ineffective. He looked at Dawit with the particular expression of a young man trying to decide whether to be brave. Dawit did not slow down. He walked at a steady pace and met the young man's eyes and held them and said in a voice pitched for just the 2 of them, "Step aside. Whatever Kareem is paying you, it is not enough for what happens next if you don't." The young man stepped aside. Inside, the community hall smelled of bodies and fear and the particular stale heat of space that had been closed with too many people in it. The windows were small and high, letting in strips of dusty light that cut across the room like bars. Along one wall, 8 women stood. They ranged in age from perhaps 16 to perhaps 60. Some had their arms around each other. Some were staring at the floor with the specific quality of stillness that is not calm. It is the suspension before breaking. Kareem Bashir stood in the center of the room. He was shorter than the stories made him. This was the first thing Dawit noticed. Compact, dark-skinned, with a beard that was somewhere between intentional and neglected. He wore a jacket that was slightly too large, The sleeves pushed up to show the kind of forearms that told you he had done physical labor before he discovered that threatening people was easier. He had 6 men arranged around the room. They were all armed. Kareem looked at Dawit walking through his door, and he did not look surprised. He looked inconvenienced. Tesfaye, he said. He did not use the title. You are far from your usual roads. 11 days of travel, Dawit said. I'm exactly where I should be. He did not look at the women yet. Not directly. He was watching Kareem, watching the 6 men, reading the geometry of the room, where the weight was, where the exits were, where the fear was highest, and most likely to make someone do something irreversible. Kareem made a gesture that was meant to look generous. You've arrived at an interesting moment. We were just discussing options. Were you? These women. Kareem turned toward them, and the women's collective posture, 8 women, 1 motion, was the kind of thing that doesn't need description to be understood. They belong to families who owe debts. It's a simple business matter. Simple, Dawit said. I'm giving them a choice. Kareem spread his hands. I'm not an unreasonable man. He said it the way men always say it. Men who have set up a room to allow only one kind of answer and then want credit for framing it as a conversation. The families can pay, Kareem continued. Or he looked at Dawit with a particular smile of a man who has decided that cruelty is currency. I choose one. As compensation. The room held its breath. Dawit looked at Kareem for a long moment. Then he looked at the 6 armed men. Then he looked finally at the 8 women along the wall. And when he did, he didn't look at them with pity. He looked at them the way a man looks at the specific thing he has decided to protect. There was no performance in it. It was the look of someone who has already made the calculation and is now just completing the motion. He turned back to Kareem. Choose any woman, Kareem said. The smile had sharpened. He was enjoying this, the theater of it, the idea that he had put even this man into a position of complicity, of impossible choice. As a gesture of understanding between us. Take one. Consider the debt resolved. Dawit said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, I'll take the one you harmed. The room went still in a different way than it had been still before. Kareem's smile did not disappear immediately. It processed the sentence, tried to find the angle that made it workable, found none. Which one? The one you already hurt. Dawit's voice had not risen. It would not rise. I can see her. I can see from here. And you will let her walk to me, and then you will let all of them walk to me, and then you and are going to have a very different conversation than the one you thought we were having. Kareem looked at him. The smile was gone. What replaced it was something more honest. The particular expression of a man recalculating, discovering that the room he had arranged no longer had the shape he thought it had. You walked in here alone, Kareem said. I did, Dawit said. My men are already being discussed by my men, Dawit said. Outside. Kareem turned toward the door. Then back to Dawit. The 6 armed men looked at each other. Then at Kareem, waiting for the signal that told them what kind of moment this was, the kind that required violence or the kind that required patience. Dawit waited. He was very good at waiting. The woman at the center of the line, the one Dawit had seen, the one with her arm held differently, cradled against her body, the one who was standing in the way of someone who has already absorbed a blow and is bracing for the next one, raised her eyes and looked directly at Dawit. She was perhaps 35. Her face had been beautiful before this morning. It was still beautiful, but it was also the face of someone who has stopped expecting to be helped and is trying to decide whether to believe what they are seeing. Dawit held her gaze for a moment. One nod. Small. Private. Then he looked back at Kareem and said nothing at all, which was louder than anything he could have said. The geometry of the room was shifting. You could feel it. The way a crowd shifts before it moves, the way water changes before it turns. Kareem was doing his calculation. 6 men with rifles. 42 soldiers outside who were, by now, in positions that Kareem's people at the entrance had either not fully assessed or not been able to report back on. A Warchief who had walked in alone and was still standing there, still waiting, without a weapon drawn, which was either the stupidest thing in the room or the most confident. Kareem knew the difference. He was not a stupid man. Cruel, yes. Opportunistic, yes. A predator of the specific kind that feeds on confusion and absence of authority. But not stupid. And the calculation was becoming clear. He had walked into this morning expecting a village. He had walked into a Warchief. Outside, something shifted. The distant sound of Dawit's convoy repositioning. Engines, the particular crunch of tires on gravel, finding new positions, drifted through the high windows. Kareem's men heard it. Their hands tightened on their weapons, which was less an act of aggression and more an act of prayer. Dawit took one step forward. Just one. The woman, he said. Not a demand. Not a threat. The statement of someone who has already decided the outcome and is waiting for the room to catch up. Kareem stood very still for a very long time. Outside, the morning was burning down to its hottest point. In Coram, the dust settled on everything. The tin roofs, the dried-out trees, the road Jonas had run down barefoot since before sunrise, the faces of people who had been waiting for years for someone to show up and mean it. The woman at the center of the line took one step forward. Then another. Kareem did not move. She walked across the room. She walked the way people walk when they are waiting for something to stop them, when they are moving on disbelief as much as on legs. She walked past his men, none of whom touched her, past the center of the room, across the remaining distance. She stopped beside Dawit. He did not look at her. He kept looking at Kareem. The rest, he said, and that was the moment, not the moment of greatest drama. That had been the step, the choice, the word harmed, landing in a room full of armed men like a stone dropped into a pool that was pretending to be solid ground. The moment that came after was quieter and, in some ways, more devastating. The moment when Kareem Bashir, warlord of the Southern Valley, man of 30 armed followers and 2 years of unchecked operation, looked at the 7 remaining women and made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his left hand. Step back. They went, one by one. Then, together, the careful shuffle of women who are not yet certain they are free, moving toward the door, toward Dawit, toward outside where the air was hot and full of dust, but was at least not this room. Dawit stood and watched until all 8 had passed him. Then, he looked at Kareem one more time. Now, he said, about that conversation. Her name was Marta. Dawit learned this 20 minutes after she walked out of the community hall, sitting on an overturned crate outside the medical tent his team had set up in the space of a hardware store whose owner had quietly opened the shutters when he saw the convoy. She told him her name the way people tell you things when they have been in shock long enough to start coming back. In pieces, each piece costing something. Marta, Gabriel Michael, 37 years old, a school teacher. The school had been closed for 8 months, but she still called herself a school teacher the way you hold onto the version of yourself that existed before the thing that happened. Her left arm had been wrenched backward. Nothing broken. The medic confirmed this, a young man named Siga who had the careful hands and careful face of someone trained to keep their reactions out of their work. A deep bruise, already purpling from elbow to shoulder. She had been the one who spoke up, Dawit was told later. When Kareem's men had entered the households that morning to collect the women, a word so blunt and insufficient for what it meant. Marta had stood in a doorway and told them they had no authority. She had used that exact word. Authority. One of the men had grabbed her arm and dragged her. She was still sitting with it cradled against her side when Dawit sat down 2 feet away and said nothing for a minute. He had learned, over decades, that silence done right was not absence. It was presence in a different form. He let the minute pass. Let her have it. You didn't know if it would work, she said finally. It was not a question. No, you walked in there without knowing. I walked in there knowing what I wanted the outcome to be, Dawit said. That's different from knowing. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is evaluating whether a person is honest or performing honesty. It was a discerning look. The look of someone who teaches children and therefore has spent years learning the difference between what people say and what they mean. What would you have done if he said no? Dawit considered this. He gave it the weight it deserved instead of the weight that would have made him sound more impressive. I would have done something else, he said. I don't know what. I was making decisions as I went. She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, a short, involuntary sound, the kind that comes out before a person decides to allow it. That is, she paused, not reassuring. No, he agreed. It isn't. Outside, the village was reorganizing itself around the aftermath. This was something Dawit had observed in dozens of communities over the years. The way people, after a crisis, immediately began the work of restoration. Not because they had processed what happened, but because the body needed something to do with its hands. Men were riding a cart that had been knocked over. Women were collecting scattered possessions from the road in front of the hall. A group of children who had been kept inside since morning were beginning, cautiously, to appear at doorways, reading the adult's body language for the permission to come out. Selamawit appeared at the edge of Dawit's vision and gave him the look that meant she needed a word. He excused himself from Marta, who was already being attended by 2 women from the village, the particular female network of care that assembles itself without instruction around the person who needs it, and walked to where his second-in-command was standing in the shade of a building that had been a cafe at some point in its history. "Kareem is gone," Selamawit said. Dawit turned to look at the community hall. Its entrance was empty. While you were with the women in the medical tent, his men filtered out in 1s and 2s. Our people on the perimeter let them go. I told them to. I know. I'm telling you he's gone. Not asking why you let him go. She paused. He'll be back. He'll be back in a different valley, with a different plan, and someone else will have to manage it. Dawit said this without pleasure. It was a statement of a reality he disliked but had learned to work within. We are not an army of occupation. We are here for today. Selamawit looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she thought he was right about something, but found the rightness unsatisfying. The community will not feel safe after we leave, she said. No, they won't. He looked at the village around him, the people moving, the children emerging, the slow return to the business of existence. That is a longer problem than one morning. What happened next happened over the course of 7 hours that were both very long and, in retrospect, very quiet. Dawit's team made their camp on the edge of the village. They were given food by a woman who seemed to cook as a form of argument. The meal was enormous, and the way she served it suggested she was making a point about hospitality that she would not articulate. Several of the community leaders came to speak with Dawit, one by one, in a manner of people who each had something specific and private to say. An old man named Haile, who had the bearing of someone who had once been a teacher and the posture of someone who had been carrying grief for a long time, sat across from Dawit and told him about the last 2 years. He spoke methodically, without dramatics. He named dates. He named incidents. He spoke about the thing that most outsiders, peacekeepers, journalists, NGO workers who came through, consistently failed to understand about what was happening in the valley. They think it is about the conflict, Haile said. The factions, the territory. They think if the fighting stops, the other things stop too. The other things, Dawit said. But what Kareem does, what others like him do, it is not a consequence of the conflict. It runs beside it. It has its own logic. It will outlast the conflict if no one addresses it specifically. Dawit knew this. He had known it for years. It was the thing that made his job, strictly defined, inadequate for the situation it was attempting to address. He was a war chief. His mandate was military coordination, conflict management, the prevention of direct armed engagement between organized factions. What Kareem did fell into a gap between categories. Not organized enough to be a faction. Not random enough to be ignored. Too mobile to be pinned. Too small to trigger the formal mechanisms. He was the thing that fell through the holes in the system. You said my name, Dawit said to Haile. Jonas, the boy who ran. He said you told him to find me specifically. That I keep my word. Haile looked at him for a moment. You came here once before. 12 years ago. Different situation. You made a promise to someone in this village that you would not forget them. Dawit went still. Did you, he said. Did I keep it? Haile was quiet for a moment. Then, you are here. The weight of that sentence was disproportionate to its length. It was the kind of sentence that seemed small and turned out to be the whole architecture of something. Dawit was here because 12 years ago, in a village he had driven through once, he had made a promise to someone whose name he could no longer recall, but whose face, now that Haile mentioned it, now that the door to that particular room of memory was opened, he could. A woman, older than Marta, with 2 children who had been standing behind her like shadows. He had told her that the valley would not be abandoned, that someone was watching. He was here, in a late afternoon, when the heat had peaked and begun its slow retreat, and the light was turning the particular gold of the dry season hour before dusk. Marta found him sitting at the edge of the village, looking at the road that led out. Not anxious to leave, but aware in the way he was always aware of the next place that needed him and the math of distance and time. She sat beside him. Her arm was in a simple sling the medic had fashioned from a piece of cloth. She held herself differently than she had that morning. Not better, exactly, not healed, but reorganized. The shock was settling into something she was finding a shape for. What happens now, she asked. To Kareem. To all of it. To here. To us. She gestured, the working arm taking in the village, the valley, the long road, everything. Dawit considered his answer carefully. He had learned that the worst thing you could give people in the aftermath of something like this morning was false reassurance. It felt kind. It was actually a cruelty, borrowing peace from the future by pretending the future was secured. I can file a detailed report. I know people in 3 different oversight bodies who will not ignore a report from me. He paused. That does not mean Kareem will be caught. It means he will be on paper, formally. It means the next time someone reports him, it adds to a file rather than starting one. Files, Martis said. I know. 8 women. Lined up like she stopped. Started again. And the response is a file. The response is everything I can do from the position I'm in, which is one piece of a larger system that is imperfect and often infuriating, and I am sorry that it is not more. He said this without apology in a self-protective sense, without the defensive coding people put on inadequacy to make themselves feel better about it. He just said it the way it was. She was quiet for a while. The village behind them made its evening sounds. A fire starting, someone calling a name, the particular domestic percussion of a place returning to itself. You said the one you harmed, Martis said. Not I choose this one, or I will take her. You said the one you harmed. Why those words? Dawit looked at her. Because I wanted him to hear himself, he said. Kareem was performing a choice, performing generosity in his mind. I want to put the real word in the room. Harmed. So that everyone in the room, his men, your women, him, would have to hold that word while I was standing there. Marta absorbed this. Her expression shifted through something complex. And you thought that would work? I thought it was the truth. I found that the truth, delivered calmly in a room full of lies, does something strange to the architecture of the room. He paused. It doesn't always work. Today it did. She nodded slowly. I thought it was theater, she said. When you walked in, I thought, another man who will negotiate something, and we will all be moved somewhere, and something will be owed to someone, and nothing will actually. She stopped. I know what you thought, he said. And you don't mind? You had every reason to think it. The only way I know to respond to that is to do something different than what those reasons predict. Behind them, someone had started cooking. The smell of injera and spiced lentils drifted through the cooling air. Somewhere a child laughed, a real laugh, the full-bodied kind, the kind that means the child has genuinely forgotten for a moment to be careful. It was a small sound. In context, it was enormous. Selamawit appeared again. This time, she brought 2 things, a folded piece of paper and an expression that meant the paper contained information that required a decision. Dawit took it. He read it once. Then he stood. We need to move the convoy, he said, to no one and everyone at once. Tonight. Marta looked up at him. What is it? He handed her the paper. She read it. Her expression changed. On the paper, in Selamawit's compact, precise handwriting, was a single line of intelligence passed up from a contact 3 villages east. Kareem had not gone to a different valley. He had gone to regroup. The information said he was coming back. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Tonight. The last light of the dry season afternoon was pulling itself over the mountains. The gold was going. Somewhere out there, on a road that Dawit knew and Kareem knew and the people of Koram had been afraid of for 2 years, something was moving toward them. Dawit looked at the village, at the fire starting, the smell of food, the child's laugh still fading in the cooling air. He looked at Selamawit. Full positions, he said. I want everyone in place before dark. She was already moving. She had been ready since this morning. She had possibly been ready for years. Marta stood beside him. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who has already been through the worst version of the day and discovered that the version they survived was survivable, and who is now applying that specific knowledge to whatever comes next. What do you need from us? She asked. The us was the village. She had apparently already elected herself the voice of it. Dawit looked at her. The schoolteacher who had stood in a doorway and used the word authority to armed men dragging her out of it, who had been the first one to step forward in the community hall, who was standing here now, one arm in a sling, asking what she could do. Tell everyone to stay inside and stay low, he said, and trust that we know what we're doing. She looked at him with the evaluating expression he was starting to recognize as her default mode. Do you, she said, know what you're doing? And he said, with a specific honesty that had gotten him to 53 years and counting in a part of the world that ate less honest men for lunch. Most of it. Enough of it. She nodded once, walked back into the village. The light finished dying. The dark came down fast and full the way it does in valleys, with no gradual evening. One moment the mountains were visible, the next they were suggestions. Stars appeared in the dry sky with the particular clarity of places with no electricity for 50 kilometers in any direction. Dawit's 42 were in position. The village was quiet. The road out of Korum stretched into the dark like a long thought that hadn't finished itself yet. And somewhere on it, in the specific silence that means something is moving without wanting to be heard, Kareem Bashir was making his way back. Darkness in Korum was not the darkness of a city. There were no streetlights, no ambient glow from neighboring blocks, no distant highway to keep the sky from going completely black. The stars were extraordinary, the kind of sky that makes you understand why ancient people built entire religions around it. But they gave almost no useful light at ground level. The valley floor absorbed the dark the way dry earth absorbs water. Completely. This was, for Dawit's purposes, good. He had positioned his 42 in a configuration that took advantage of two things he had observed during the day. The geography of the road into Korum, which curved twice before straightening into the village center, and the specific overconfidence of men like Kareem, who returned to places not because they had reassessed the situation, but because returning was itself a message they needed to send. Kareem coming back tonight was not strategy. It was ego. The Warchief had taken something from him, the theater, the performance of power, the room he had arranged, and Kareem was coming back to take something in return. This made him predictable. Selamawat understood all of this without needing it explained. She had positioned two teams at the first curve and one team at the second, with Dawit and his core 8 in the village center itself. Not to ambush. Dawit did not want blood if blood could be avoided. Not here, not in a village that had enough to carry, but to make the geometry undeniable before anything happened. To let Kareem's men round the first curve and discover in the dark that the math had changed. At 9:30, a scout came back with a whispered count. 31 men, moving on foot, which meant they had left their vehicles somewhere on the far road. Smart, or someone was advising Kareem, and Kareem was listening tonight in a way he hadn't been listening this morning. They had torches, not lit yet, held unlit, which meant they knew they were approaching a situation that required some measure of stealth. They were spread across the road in a loose group that would tighten as they entered the village. 31 to 42. The numbers were workable. They were not the point. The point was never the numbers, which was something Dawit had spent a career trying to explain to people who thought conflict management was arithmetic. The numbers told you what was possible. They did not tell you what was necessary. What was necessary was almost always something smaller and more specific than a full engagement. He needed one thing to happen. He needed Kareem's men to stop before the village center. He needed them to stop and to see, in the dark, 42 positions arranged around them. Not guns raised, not aggressive, just present, just clearly there in the dark. And to make the calculation that this morning's calculation should have already produced. That there was no version of this night that ended well for them. Dawit was standing in the village center when he heard the first curve group go still. He heard it the way you hear a crowd of people holding their breath. Not a sound, but the sudden quality of the silence, the way it becomes dense and intentional. Then, a murmur. Then, the particular shuffle of men who had decided to stop moving without being told to stop. The scout came back to him in the dark, barely visible, materializing at his elbow. "They've stopped at the first curve," she said. She was 25 from a village 3 valleys west, and she had the quality of stillness and motion that made her Dawit's best scout. She could move through dark and brush without friction, without sound, without the world knowing she had passed through it. "They're talking." Who to? To each other. Deciding. Good. Deciding was good. Men who are deciding are not men who are moving. Dawit wanted as much deciding as possible on the other side of the dark. He walked forward. Selamawat, materializing from his left at the precise moment he started moving, fell in a step beside him. She did not ask where he was going. She already knew. She probably thought it was a questionable idea. She was coming anyway, which was the specific way she expressed both her disagreement and her loyalty simultaneously, by being there. They walked the road, through the village, out the other side, through the dry brush that bordered the road for 200 meters before the first curve. Dawit did not use a light. He had walked in enough dark places that his feet had developed a working relationship with uncertain ground. He moved quietly for a large man, the particular economy of motion that comes from having done exactly this more times than he could count. At the edge of the curve, he stopped. He could hear them now. Not their words yet, just the quality of voices that are trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding the specific muttered register of men who are tense and discussing the tension. He could see just barely the shapes of them, 20, 30 shapes in the dark, the occasional faint gleam of metal. He had done this exact thing before, in 3 different countries under different flags and different skies. Walked to the edge of a group of armed men in the dark and spoken first. The theory, if it could be called that, was that the first voice was the one that set the terms. Not the loudest voice. The first one. If you spoke before they expected you to speak, you owned the moment before they could decide what the moment was. He was about to do it. Selamawit put her hand on his arm, a brief contact or signal for wait, and he held. From somewhere inside the group of men, a voice rose above the murmur. Kareem's voice. He was not speaking to his men. He was speaking outward, into the dark, toward the village. His voice was carrying the deliberate projection of someone who knows they are being heard. Tesfaye. The name landed in the dark like a stone in water. Dawit did not move. Tesfaye, I know you're listening. Kareem's voice was steady, measured, not angry, which was more interesting than angry would have been. He had had several hours and whatever vehicle journey to process the morning and land somewhere more calculated. I have 30 men. You have 40. In the dark. I am not interested in a fight tonight. Dawit looked at Selamawit. She looked back. The silence between them had the quality of a conversation conducted entirely without words. He stepped forward, out of the brush, onto the road, into the space where Kareem's voice had been directed. I'm here, he said. The shapes ahead shifted. 31 men, finding him with their eyes, adjusting, recalculating the distance between themselves and the voice. He heard Kareem step forward. One person separating from the group, moving toward him, stopping approximately 10 meters away. In the dark, they were both suggestions of themselves, more posture than feature. You made me look foolish this morning, Kareem said. You came into a village and lined up 8 women, Dawit said. You made yourself look foolish. Those were legitimate, Kareem. Not harsh, not even sharp. Just the particular weight of a name said by someone who is not interested in the next sentence. Silence. What do you want? Kareem asked. It was the question Dawit had been waiting for, because it meant the conversation had moved past the part where Kareem was still performing certainty. What do you want was the question of a man who was ready to negotiate, even if he would not call it that, even if he would go home tonight and reframe it as a tactical withdrawal to anyone who asked. I want you to hear something clearly, Dawit said. Once, so that you have no reason to tell yourself later that you didn't know. He waited a beat. Let the dark hold the space. What happened today, the 8 women, the hall, the choosing, that is on paper now, it has been transmitted to every oversight body in this region whose attention I am able to get, and I'm able to get attention from more of them than you probably know. Your name is on the paper. Your location. The specifics. Another beat. You have been doing what you do in the gaps between authority. Those gaps are going to get smaller. Not today. Not because of one report. But the paper exists now, and it did not exist this morning. Kareem said nothing. I'm also telling you, Dawit continued, that this valley is not empty. The people here are not invisible. I know that is what it has felt like to you, that you can operate here because no one important is watching. I'm asking you to revise that belief. You can't be everywhere, Kareem said. No, I can't. No equivocación. But I have been in this work long enough to have people in many places who report to me and who share my reports. And I am known in this region as someone who, when he makes a promise, keeps it. He let that land. I'm promising you that if I hear your name again in connection with any village in this valley, I will make it my specific business to find you, not to kill you, to bring you to the people who will document you formally on the record in a way that follows you. In the dark, the shapes of Kareem's 30 men had gone very still. What Dawit was doing, and he knew it, and Selamawit knew it, standing 3 feet behind him, was not entirely within the formal boundaries of his mandate. He was not authorized to make personal promises to warlords on behalf of regional oversight bodies. What he was doing was what he had always done when the formal boundaries proved insufficient for the situation. He was using the one asset he had that no mandate could give him and no bullet could take away. His word. In this valley, in this specific geography of conflict and consequence, Dawit Tesfai's word was the hardest currency in circulation. Not because he was powerful in the official sense. He wasn't. But because over decades, through countless situations exactly like this one, and nothing exactly like this one, he had never said something he didn't do. The community of Quorum had built its survival strategy around that. A boy named Jonas had run barefoot since before sunrise because of it. An old man named Haile had held it as the answer to the question, did you keep it? Kareem was standing in the dark, trying to find the angle that made this a bluff. He couldn't. I have man, Kareem said. It was almost plaintive. Yes. You can't promise me. I can promise you exactly what I said. Not more. Not less. Dawit's voice was even. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are tonight. I'm telling you that who you are is now documented and visible, and that this valley specifically is a valley where someone is watching. What you do with that information is your decision. The night held everything in suspension for what felt like longer than it was. Then, from the dark, Kareem said something Dawit had not expected. Why do you care? Not hostile, not rhetorical, genuine. The voice of a man who had spent his entire adult life in a world where people operated from self-interest or fear or ideology, and who genuinely did not have a working framework for the alternative. Dawit stood with the question for a moment. Because someone in this village told me, 12 years ago, that I would not forget them, he said. And I forgot them. And came back anyway. He paused. That's all I have. Silence. Then, the sound of Kareem's feet on the road, turning. The group of 31 shapes beginning the slow reversal of their approach, finding the road that would take them back to wherever they had left their vehicles, back into the dark of the valley, and whatever the night held for them beyond this hill, this curve, this conversation. Dawit stood and listened to them go. Selamawit stood beside him. When the sounds had faded entirely, she said, he may still come back. He may. Different night. Different approach. Yes. He turned back toward the village. That's why I wrote the report. They walked back through the dark. The stars were still extraordinary. The valley still absorbed the light completely. Somewhere behind them, Kareem's 31 were navigating the same road in the same dark, and whatever they were saying to each other, whatever they were telling themselves about tonight, the paper already existed. The name was already on it. The specifics were already transmitted to the people who held the kinds of records that outlasted individual operations. It was not justice. Dawit knew this and did not pretend otherwise. But it was a door closed where the door had been opened. A calculation changed. A man who had operated in the assumption of invisibility, now operating with the knowledge that someone had looked directly at him and written down what they saw. In the village, the fire had gone low. Most of the community was inside, as Marta had told them to be. But Dawit could see, at the edge of the firelight, the shapes of a few people who had not gone in, who had stayed, who were waiting, who could not quite bring themselves to trust that waiting inside was enough. Haile was one of them. The old man with the teacher's bearing, and the grief posture was standing at the edge of the light, looking at the road. When he saw Dawit and Selamawit coming back from the direction of the dark, he did something that Dawit would remember for a long time. He did not cheer. He did not call out. He did not make any of the gestures of relief that people make in dramatic situations when the tension breaks. He just nodded. The same small, private nod, like the one Dawit had given Marta across a room full of armed men. The nod that means, I see you. I believe what I'm seeing. We do not need to name it. Dawit nodded back. He walked into the village. He walked to where his team was positioned, spoke briefly with each post, confirmed that the road was clear and the night was holding. He told Selamawit to maintain watch until 3 in the morning and then to rotate the teams. Then he sat down on the ground beside the low fire, and a woman who had been cooking all evening without being asked brought him a plate of food and set it beside him, and he ate it, and the night went on. It was not the end of anything. He knew that. Kareem would operate somewhere. Another valley, another gap, another set of women lined up in another room. The report would sit in someone's file. The oversight bodies would move at the pace they moved, which was the pace of institutions that were necessary and insufficient simultaneously. The people of Quorum would wake up tomorrow, and The day after that, in a valley that was still contested, still exhausted, still living in the territory between the endings of conflicts and the beginnings of the next ones. But Marta would teach school again. The school would reopen. He did not know this as a fact. He knew it as the conclusion of a sentence that started with, "A woman who stands in a doorway and uses the word authority at armed men dragging her out of it will, when the immediate threat has passed, find her way back to the room she was dragged from." He knew it because of the way she had asked him, "What do you need from us?" Not what can I do to survive. What do you need from us? The plural. The already elected spokesperson. The woman who 6 hours after being in a line of 8 women waiting for a warlord's choice was already thinking in terms of collective capacity and next steps. He sat beside the fire and let the food warm him and thought about the boy who had run barefoot since before sunrise, about the old man's nod, about the 12-year-old promise to a woman whose face he had remembered when the door was opened. He thought about what Kareem had asked. Why do you care? He had given the true answer, which was not a satisfying answer. He forgot people and came back anyway. He operated in gaps that were not his formal mandate. He made promises with no institutional backing except the record of every promise he had already kept. He was a man in a system that was imperfect and often infuriating, doing the specific things the system could not do because the system was a structure, and the moments that mattered required a person. He cared because somewhere a long time ago, in a situation whose specifics had blurred but whose feeling had not, someone had been in the position of the 8 women in the hall, and no one had walked through the door. He had walked through it today. That was the only answer. The walking through was the answer. You could not explain it into existence. You could only do it. Selimawit settled beside him on the ground. She did not take any food. She looked at the fire for a while. "The report," she said finally. "The oversight bodies. Yes. You know how long these things take. Yes. Kareem could operate for another 2 years in a different valley before anyone formally acts. Yes. He did not dress this up. That is the realistic probability." She was quiet for a moment. Then, what was the point of today? He looked at the fire. "Jonas ran barefoot for 5 hours," he said, "because 12 years ago someone told a woman in this village that she was not forgotten. He ran because of a promise I barely remember making." He let that sit. The point of today is the thing that happens in 12 years when someone I haven't met yet is running somewhere in some kind of dark, and they run towards someone who is in this village tonight. Who watched what happened here? Who carries it? Selimawit was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. The stars were extraordinary. The valley floor was dark and enormous and old, and in it, in one small village with a tired school and a patchwork roof on the community hall, 42 people were keeping watch through the night. Not because a mandate required it, not because the arithmetic made it necessary, but because a warchief who had forgotten a promise came back to keep it, and because the word he used in a room full of armed men was harmed, and because a schoolteacher with a wrenched arm stood up first and walked across a floor that she had no guarantee was safe to walk across. These were small things. Dawit knew they were small things. He also knew that small things kept consistently over years in the specific and deliberate way of someone who has decided that keeping them is the point, were the only things that accumulated into something larger than the dark that surrounded them. The fire went lower. Somewhere in the village, a door opened and stayed open, and the light from inside spilled out onto the road.